Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I'm pleased to welcome you to the fourth installment of our summer virtual book talk series. Before we begin today's talk, I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by the writer, journalist, and Emmy Award-winning news producer, A'Lelia Bundles. A'Lelia is the former Deputy Bureau Chief of ABC News Washington, Chair Emerita of the National Archives Foundation, and the author of 4 books about her great-great-grandmother, Madam C.J. Walker. A'Lelia is also a trustee of Columbia University. She serves on the advisory board of the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative, and she's a member of Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library Council. This afternoon, we'll discuss Self-Made, which is a new edition of A'Lelia's best-selling biography of Madam C.J. Walker, titled On Her Own Ground. It's also the inspiration for the fictional Netflix series, Self-Made, starring Octavia Spencer. A'Lelia's book documents a life that is fascinating, complex, and interwoven with some of the most important social and historical movements of the late 19th and early 20th century in America. I'm delighted to have her here and look forward to our program. We'll begin this afternoon with a brief reading, followed by a conversation. After that, we'll open the virtual floor to you. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to submit your questions at any time. We only ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible. Now, it's my pleasure to give the virtual floor to A'Lelia Bundles.
Thank you very much, Tamiko. I wish I could be there with you personally, as we are when we have our Schlesinger Library meetings, but it's great to see you virtually, and I'm really, really thrilled to be a part of this summer book talk. So I am going to read a little bit from the prologue to my book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, and to give people an overview of Madam Walker, and then I'm really ready to dive into questions. So this is from starting with page 2 of the prologue. As a pioneer of the modern hair care industry and founder of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, Madam Walker created marketing schemes, training opportunities, and distribution strategies as innovative as those of any entrepreneur of her time. As an early advocate of women's economic independence, she provided lucrative incomes for thousands of African American women who otherwise would have been consigned to jobs as farm laborers, washerwomen, and maids. As a philanthropist, she reconfigured the philosophy of charitable giving in the Black community with her unprecedented contributions to the YMCA and the NAACP. As a political activist, she dreamed of organizing her sales agents to use their economic clout to protest lynching and racial injustice. As much as any woman of the 20th century, Madam Walker paved the way for the profound social changes that altered women's place in American society. My personal journey to write On Her Own Ground, the first comprehensive biography of my great-great-grandmother, really began before I could read. The Walker women, Madam, her daughter A'Lelia Walker, and my grandmother May Walker, were already beckoning me at an early age, sometimes whispering, sometimes clamoring with the message that I must tell their story. In a faint childhood memory, their spirits enveloped me in filtered gray light beneath a tall window inside my grandmother's bedroom. On a nearby dresser just beyond my reach, I can see their sepia faces inside hand-carved frames. Even as a little girl, I sensed that these grandmothers belonged not only to me, but to the world, and to those who would claim them for their own dreams and fantasies. Black history books had long recited the outlines of Madam Walker's classic American rags to riches rise, from uneducated washerwoman to international entrepreneur and social activist, from daughter of enslaved parents to hair care industry pioneer and philanthropist. Poet Langston Hughes crowned A'Lelia Walker the joy goddess of Harlem's 1920s. The Negro press fancied May, A'Lelia's adopted daughter and only legal heir, a tan Cinderella. By the time I discovered the Walker women's public mythology, they had already begun to draw me into the world of their private truths. My grandfather, Marion Roland Perry Jr., first met May during the summer of 1927 at Villa Lewaro, Madam Walker's lavish Irvington-on-Hudson, New York mansion. A handsome young attorney and World War I Army officer, he was quite proud of a lineage that included college-educated parents. May was a recent divorcee and the future Walker heiress, whose thick waist-length hair had helped sell thousands of tins of Madam C.J. Walker's wonderful hair grower. That weekend, A'Lelia Walker invited Marion to the Cotton Club with her friends and without May to take the measure of the man she considered a potential son-in-law. She discreetly slipped him a $100 bill to gauge his comfort with paying large tabs. Apparently, he passed her test. For a few weeks later, on August 27th, he and May drove to Port Chester, New York in his green Pierce Arrow to be married by a justice of the peace. The following July, my mother, A'Lelia May Perry, was born. In 1955, when my father, my mother, and I moved to Indianapolis, I was 3 years old, and May had been dead for nearly a decade. Later, on visits to Papa's apartment, I escaped into May's room, drawn time and again by a mauve moire silk vanity. Even now, I can feel quiet enchantment as I recall grasping cool ivory mahjong tiles and miniature enameled King Tut mummy charms. I remember a fluffy ostrich fan in one drawer and mother of pearl opera glasses in another. The more I stirred May's belongings, the more the scent of her Shalimar dusting powder emerged, masking the familiar grandfather mustiness that clung to all the other rooms. Each piece of clothing, each photograph, each bejeweled mirror and monogrammed napkin became a genie's lamp waiting to be rubbed.
That's wonderful, A'Lelia. Thank you so much for that reading. And I think I want to start by discussing biography as a genre. You have written about your commitment to tell the truth, to present an honest and complex biography of Madam Walker rather than a hagiography. At the same time, you're writing about family. And I wonder if you can say more about the challenges of that, of writing a complex, truthful history, and also writing about someone with whom you have a personal connection.
So I have a personal connection, but I'm also a journalist, and I really wanted to get at the complexity of Madam Walker. And while young people ask me if I knew Madam Walker, I tell them I am old, but not that old. She died in 1919. I wasn't born until 1952, and so there were a few generations. And I learned about her because my mother went to work every day at the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, and there were things in our house that had belonged to her. But I sort of knew the little piece of the story that was told over and over again. She was born on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana, was a washerwoman until she was 38, was a millionaire when she died, employed thousands of women. So I had to do a lot of research in 12 different cities, and it really became a quest of mine to find as many facts as I could, and then to put her within the context of the times. As you say, she really crosses many, from the Civil War through World War I. She knew everyone from Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois to Ida B. Wells and Mary McLeod Bethune. So I wanted to tell the story of the era of that first generation of people who emerged after the Civil War, who were free people, who finally were free people. And so I didn't want to, do any kind of, as you say, hagiography. I wanted to really tell the true story. And then I had one little lovely gift from my mother in this sense. When I was at Columbia in graduate school and really starting to do this serious research, my mother was quite ill. She had terminal lung cancer, and I went home to Indianapolis for the Christmas holidays. And I didn't really conceive that my mom was not going to be around, but it turned out to be one of my last conversations with her. And I said, I'm starting to discover that, Madam Walker's not perfect. She has flaws. The story is not that little paragraph that's always, triumphant. And I said, what do I do about that? And she said, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. And that was, a great gift for me.
Wonderful, wonderful gift. So let me ask you to talk about the way in which your understanding of Madam Walker evolved or changed over time. You talk about this a bit in the prologue to your book.
So when I was a student in Cambridge, the last thing I wanted to do was to talk about Madam Walker. I was much more interested in A'Lelia Walker, who was part of the Harlem Renaissance, and she had known all these writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, who I was interested in and was studying. And Madam Walker was complicated because it was the era of afros exploding, and many people associated Madam Walker with the hot comb. So she did not invent the hot comb, but that's what a lot of people thought. And that was really kind of not what I was focused on. I had a big afro, and I didn't really want to be identified with that. But I will say that W.B. Du Bois was my intellectual hero, having come from Indiana at a almost, overwhelmingly white school. I needed an African-American intellectual scholarly hero, and he was that. And I was doing some research in Widener Library for something, I don't even remember what, and I came across some old bound issues of The Crisis, the NAACP's magazine, and I found Du Bois's obit of Madam Walker in August 1919, and he had very positive things to say about her. His analysis of her was a critique different from anything I'd ever read. And I thought, well, if my intellectual hero can find something about her, I need to re-examine. And that was really a turning point for me.
Wonderful. That's a great experience and story. Let's talk a little bit about your research process. How did you approach the work of going into the archives and turning every page, to borrow a famous phrase from Robert Caro and his editor?
Yeah, it is an obsession, as you know. as you're writing now about Constance Baker Motley, you just want one more thing, one more fact. And I have a couple of things that happened early on. My grandfather really was the person who kept everything. After A'Lelia Walker died in 1931, my grandmother moved her personal papers and furniture and clothes and everything back to Indianapolis to the apartment. That was the apartment where I discovered all these things. And my grandfather saved things, and he told me stories. He was really kind of my window on that world. As well, the Walker Company in Indianapolis had never gone out of business, and Madam Walker's secretary, who had started working for her in 1914, was still there in the 1970s. And she had saved files and files and files to the point where we now have more than 40,000 documents, photographs, business records, personal letters that have been digitized at the Indiana Historical Society. So in the 1980s, when I was really starting my research, that was my foundation of my research. And then I interviewed, fortunately, there were a few of the elders who were still around, people who had worked for the company, people who had known Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker. I interviewed them, and then I traveled to more than a dozen cities, to historical societies and libraries and courthouses to find these documents. So I now have, it's embarrassing to say, 2 rooms in my house that are full of research.
Oh, wow. That is a lot. Wow, that is amazing. And yet we're so happy that you did it, and you're continuing to work on this very compelling family. Um, so let me ask you about the balance between telling a story about an individual and writing a compelling portrait about Madam Walker, and also talking about the broader context, which in this case is a story about an America that is steeped in racial injustice and also resistance to that inequality. So how do you tell a story that's both personal and also about America?
You know, it is really an interesting challenge because biography and straight history are often considered at odds with each other. You know, they're like on different planets. But I really am grateful to, especially a number of African American women historians who have become friends of mine. And again, when I was, having dinner in the quad at Radcliffe, Nell Painter was working on her PhD. And so Nell was the first, woman historian, Black woman historian I'd ever met. And Nell's one of her early books, The Exodusters, happened to have had information that was very relevant to Madam Walker's life. The Exodusters, that was happening in Louisiana and Mississippi, and actually in her community. As it turns out, Curtis Pollard, Madam Walker, as she was Sarah Breedlove at the time, her family minister was a Black state senator who was chased out of Louisiana by the Ku Klux Klan during that period of the Exodusters. And so I had this connection with people like Nell and others who were really writing about context. And I realized that there were so many things specifically about Madam Walker's early life that I didn't know, that I needed that historical research to create context. And so I was able to take the personal part that I knew and to try to put it in the sense of history. And I also realized I was writing the book that I wish had been written for me. Long before I heard the Toni Morrison quote, I literally needed this book, and I wanted the next generation to be able to have it. And even now people will say to me, oh, I had no idea that Black people were doing this, and that in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But it's because our history books did not tell us that. And I wanted to make sure that I put this context there with all of the people, with the social issues, the political issues, the racial issues that were going on at the time.
That's wonderful. Thank you for the story about Radcliffe Quad and also Nell Irvin Painter. I remember the Exodusters on my reading list in graduate school and how revelatory it was. And so we share that common experience of finding these, Black women historians who've written stories that are similar to the stories that we want to write and being so inspirational. I really appreciate that.
It all goes back to a professor, Tamika.
Oh, yes, it does. It really does. Those of us who are fortunate enough to find that inspiration in a professor. So in your prologue, you mentioned that Madam Walker's rise is in many ways a classic rags to riches story. So she is, a self-made American business person. And she was held up as an inspiring model by many, even during her lifetime. But of course, there's a tension between her as an American archetype and the broader story of African-American history, which is in part one of repression in this country. So I wonder how you feel about this tension.
Yeah, that's the Self-Made, the title of the Netflix series, is not a title that I would have given it, because I know that there is a sort of a scholarly debate. What does that really mean? And in her case, it is, I know that there were people who helped her. And that was something that didn't come through in the series, but that I really try to tell. And that is when Sarah Breedlove, young widow, 20 years old, moved from Louisiana to St. Louis, where her brothers were barbers and where they had gone earlier as part of the Exodusters movement. She was a poor, uneducated washerwoman, but it was the women of St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church who reached out to Sarah Breedlove and began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. It was the school teachers. It was people in the missionary society. She had a good enough voice to be in the choir. So she began to model herself after those women. And in 1904, when the National Association of Colored Women met in St. Louis with Margaret Murray Washington, Booker T. Washington's wife, as the president, they met in her church. So even though she was still a poor washerwoman at the time, she was able to observe these women. So later, when she founded her company and she was training women, it wasn't just, she was training them about hair and how to be sales agents, but she was also helping them organize themselves politically in the same way she had seen the women of the NACW. When she had her first convention in 1917, she modeled it after those women. So this idea of self-made, she had many examples of women who were organized, who were smart, who were educated, who were politically astute, who really created a template for her.
Very good. And so I want to talk about philanthropy, which I know is very important to your story and significant in her life and legacy, and also something that is not that well known. So I wonder if you can say a bit about the importance of philanthropy to Madam Walker, and why do you think that part of her legacy is less well known, if you agree with that.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. It is less well known because making $1 million, that's what a lot of people want to hear about. And, for me, that's not really the measure of who she was. It was what she did in the community. It was the women she motivated. It was the generational wealth that she helped to create. It was the emphasis on education and political activism. But I think this philanthropy is very key to understanding who she was. And it goes back to those women, the Mite Missionary Society, the women of the NACW, this idea of whatever blessings you have, you should give back, you should share. And even when she was a poor washerwoman, she was helping to collect pennies and nickels for the Missionary Society and for families who were in need. And that carried through the examples of the AME Church. So among the things she did early on when she got to Indianapolis was to contribute $1,000 to the building fund of the Black YMCA. And when she did that, it shocked people because no Black woman had ever given that kind of money for that kind of cause. But at the time she said, I'm doing this to help our boys because I want to help our girls. And that is what I'm interested in. At this 1917 convention, she gave prizes to the women who had sold the most products, but also to the women who had contributed the most to charity in their communities. And she said to them, your first duty as Walker agents is to humanity. So she really did see the power of not just making money, but of using that money to make a difference in your community.
That's powerful part of her legacy, and one that I'm so glad that you highlight. Now let's talk about her politics. So over the course of her life, Madam Walker interacted with a number of towering figures, and it looks like her ideology maybe shifted over time. Early in her career, she worked hard to capture the attention of Booker T. Washington and his Negro Business League, and later she's a donor to W.B. Du Bois's NAACP, and she seems to touch all the bases. I think, though, that the deeper point is that she maintains these deep connections to different and often opposing factions throughout her life. At her funeral, her honorary pallbearers were they included Baptists and AMEs, Bookerites, and NAACPers. And I wonder if you can talk about those varying connections as a window onto how her ideology may have changed over her lifetime.
I think you're right, this sort of shifting ideology. But as I sort of grapple with trying to understand that, I think that ultimately her North Star was, whatever is good for the race. So, and where some people had to make a decision whether they were going to be Bookerites or whether they were going to be with Du Bois. And we know that sort of famous back and forth between the two of them. often people needed something. They needed funds, they needed endorsements. And she, because she had her own money that really had come from Black women, did not have to choose sides. And so she, whatever she thought was going to be helpful to Black people is what she pushed. I actually was just doing some research for a piece that I'm writing on the 19th Amendment. Ida B. Wells's great-granddaughter, Michelle Dester, and I are doing a joint article, and I wanted to revisit why Woodrow Wilson segregated federal offices. And so I was doing some reading, and that took me to a meeting where Madam Walker hosted Ida B. Wells and Monroe Trotter in her home in New York. Well, this made her attorney, Mr. Ransom, extremely nervous too, because Monroe Trotter, Bostonian, was quite radical, and so was Ida B. Wells. And Mr. Ransom was in touch with Emmett Scott, Booker T. Washington's deputy, and he had sort of warned him about these relationships that Madam Walker had with these radicals. And in fact, Madam and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a Black spy named Walter Loving, who worked in the Military Intelligence Division. And in a classified report, they were written up as Negro subversives.
Oh, wow.
But Madam Walker did, in fact, go across the spectrum.
Wow. That's great. So let's continue this conversation about Ida B. Wells from the perspective of gender. Ida B. Wells, journalist, active in the suffrage movement, and this year when we're marking the centennial of suffrage, it seems important as ever to say a bit about gender in her life and in the struggle for civil and human rights of which she was a part.
Yeah, I really loved finding the connection with Ida B. Wells because, as we know, Ida B. Wells was a complicated woman and did not suffer fools. But in her autobiography, Crusade for Justice, she mentions Madam Walker. That was one of my, favorite finds in doing my research. And she talks about having met Madam Walker early on and kind of being skeptical of her and not thinking, who was this woman who thought she could build a business, and then being turned around and seeing that she had in fact done what she'd promised, but also that they found common cause, that they both were very involved in the anti-lynching movement. And obviously Ida B. Wells was on the front lines and going to investigate it, but Madam Walker was helping to finance the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign. But they both faced the gender gap. And in fact, there's one little episode where Ida B. Wells mentions it in her book, and Madam Walker mentions it in some of her personal letters, where they are both at a meeting at Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, as many African Americans are observing the peace talks that are starting to happen after World War I in Paris, and they want to go. And Madam and Ida B. are elected delegates. But the men say, well, if you have to pay your own way. And both of them protested that and ultimately were elected as full delegates. Now, neither of them got to go to Paris, but they were openly facing these men who were essentially saying women they aren't important enough to go represent us.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So let's talk about the fact that you originally wrote Self-Made nearly 20 years ago is On Our Own Ground, as we've been talking about. But the book has received renewed attention recently with the release of this Netflix miniseries. And, when I think about that, I pull back and I think, well, that kind of uptake is both an author's wildest dreams and also potentially fraught, since it involves translation, ceding control. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the opportunity came about and just generally your thoughts about the challenges of adapting a complex history of the sort that you've written.
Yes, you're right. Wildest dreams and fraught. Last night I did a seminar with Stanley Nelson, who's the documentary filmmaker, and Stanley's first documentary in 1989 was $2 and a Dream about Madam Walker. He has a connection because his grandfather F.B. Ransom was Madam Walker's attorney, but we had a conversation about that. And it's still 30 years later, still holds up. So as a journalist and as a person who writes history and biography, I'm a big fact person. But at the same time, you know that a Hollywood production reaches millions of people that you would never be able to reach. And as my Radcliffe classmate, Winifred White Nizer, who worked in television movies for a long time, tells me it is a minor miracle when a film is actually made or when a series is made. So for that reason, it is one's wildest dreams. But Hollywood changes things. There is, creative license. And while I had script review, I did not have script control. And so there were many things that I would have done differently. And part of it is understanding what was happening with that generation, that first generation out of slavery, who they really were. And I don't think Hollywood quite grasped it, even with Black writers and Black showrunners. I don't think that sort of deep, nuanced sense of history is not always there. So I find myself now, like Octavia Spencer was great. I loved seeing the fact that business was being developed, but there were characters who were inserted who I wouldn't have put in. But I'm finding myself now really being an advocate for a partnership, a real collaboration between directors and producers and studios who must tell a story to make it interesting, to make their money back, understandably, and historians and biographers and journalists who really know the history, if for no other reason than to keep people from having embarrassing anachronisms in the shows.
Oh, that's a terrific aspiration. And there are a lot of audience questions, including more about the series. Before we move there, I want to ask you, circle back to your membership on the Schlesinger Library Council. You are very well aware of and involved in the library's efforts to diversify its archival collection. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about how your work on Madam C.J. Walker shows the importance of that kind of effort.
Yeah, well, I definitely, my papers, not all of the 2 rooms are coming to the Schlesinger. You guys don't want everything, but a lot of my collection will be coming there eventually. But I could not have written the kind of book that I wrote without these documents, without the papers of other people who knew Madam Walker, or the newspapers that have been collected, or the random scrapbooks in a place like the Missouri Historical Society. But those little tidbits and all of these places really help to bring a person alive. We're fortunate that we have Madam Walker's letters, but those letters didn't start until 1910. She was in her 30s by that point. The first 38 years of her life, I really had to use city directories and books about other people who lived in St. Louis or who lived in Mississippi or Louisiana, or Nell's book, The Exodusters, to really fill in the blanks. But it is these original documents that allow us to tell a story. I mean, I'm just thinking, yesterday I was looking on the Woodrow Wilson library page for this information I was trying to do about Wilson and segregation. And in fact, there is a letter from a young white secretary who works in the engraving bureau, who has written to Ellen Wilson saying, those Negro girls are washing their hands in the same bowl that we're using, and we don't like that. Well, that just little piece of information really illuminates things. And over and over again, I was able to find that kind of material that helped me tell Madam Walker's story. So I encourage everybody who, I will just say this. I have many friends who have done interesting things, whether it's in public health, whether it's in entertainment, whether it's in law, whatever, and who are my age, and who think, why would anybody want my papers? What have I done? But you would be surprised at just how important it is for me, as I do my research, that I found a woman who was a lawyer who somehow intersected with Madam Walker, and that opened up a new door. So all of these things are important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Now let's go to some audience questions. The first one is, how do you think generational wealth and success, like Madam C.J. Walker and her daughter had, is created or preserved? And how can the Black community promote financial wealth and entrepreneurial growth?
So, the generational wealth is something that I think a lot of, Black families now, people will sort of beat themselves up and think, why don't we have that? But, as we have done, as we've learned more about redlining and we've learned more about systematic ways of preventing us from owning homes and having equity, that really has destroyed our ability to have generational wealth. And I would say Madam Walker actually saw that. She built homes. She was trying to encourage people to buy real estate. Some of her agents, when they came to the conventions, talked about the homes they had bought, talked about the property that they were investing in and how they were educating their children. And that education and real estate are the ways that we create wealth, but those things were systematically denied and destroyed in our community. So that if you looked at somebody who bought a house in Baltimore in the 1930s and they were able to give it to the next generation and the next generation, if they were Black, those houses are probably in neighborhoods that were redlined. Mm-hmm. And if somebody white in a white neighborhood bought property with the same value, those houses are now worth $1 million. And so that path to generational wealth was destroyed for us. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to, re-examine what our expectations are, but it still is the way to build generational wealth. It's also true with education. I mean, I will say, by the time my generation came along, I did not have a trust fund. So that generational wealth did not continue. But both of my parents worked, they were college educated, and I didn't have college loans, even though I did go to school in Cambridge. The tuition was a lot less than it is now. But being able to graduate without student debt mm-hmm. was a head start. And so that's very, very difficult for folks now.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, other questions. So there are people who want to know a bit more about who inspired Madam Walker to start her businesses. And I know you touched on that. Maybe you can expand a little bit.
Sure. So Madam Walker's brothers were barbers. And so she was first exposed to the hair care business from them. And then her hair began to fall out. And her story was that the idea came to her in a dream, but we know that it is more complicated than that, that for a while she was a sales agent for Annie Malone, who ultimately became her rival and her competitor, who also was a very successful businesswoman and philanthropist. But she sold Malone's products for about 1.5 years. She was in St. Louis. She moved to Denver. And while she was in Denver, she was a cook on the side for a man who owned the largest pharmacy west of the Mississippi River. And he saw that she was selling these products. Apparently, I don't know what happened. She and Malone fell out with each other, but she ultimately started her own company. One story is that she tweaked the formula. There were other products already on the market that were similar, like Cuticure, that had been around for decades. There were other Black-owned companies besides Malone's that were manufacturing similar products. It was essentially an ointment with sulfur that healed dandruff. That was sort of the basics. But she decided that she was going into business for herself, and that's how she started.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So there's a question about Madam Walker's impact on American business. She was a business innovator in the way she developed a form of multi-level marketing, developed a national network of agents, and also mobilized them as a group for political and social change. And so this audience member wants to know what you think about her impact on American business.
Well, definitely it was corporate responsibility was important to her, and making sure that her employees, her sales agents, were compensated fairly, that they had vacations, that they had insurance. So she was ahead of her time in that way. She really was a marketing genius, and how she developed those ideas really when advertising was still in its infancy. But I think she saw herself in these women as she was starting to train women. She traveled all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. And I think she realized that the hair care product in some ways became a means to an end, that what the women needed was education and economic independence. So it became a kind of a motivational ministry almost to help these women become economically independent so they wouldn't have to be washerwomen and maids and sharecroppers. But I think that she really did see the opportunity to take business, to take sales and merge it with the kind of politics and the kind of social mission that she saw with the National Association of Colored Women, with the NAACP.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are a number of questions about Madam Walker's philanthropy, with audience members wanting to know more about her philanthropy and reactions to it, as she was a Black woman millionaire, which was unique. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think that it started really with the AME Church, the kind of outreach that the church was well known for. That was her early inspiration. But this gift to the YMCA, this $1,000 gift, got her a lot of attention in national media, from especially Black newspapers, some white publications as well. But as she became more well known and as people knew she had money, people came to her. And so she wanted to make sure she was giving the turkeys at Christmas time. But also when she talked with W.B. Du Bois, he talked to her about the anti-lynching movement. And so she gave money to that. Her largest gift before she died was a $5,000 pledge to the NAACP's anti-lynching fund. She also gave scholarships at a number of schools, Charlotte Hawkins Brown's Palmer Memorial Institute, to Tuskegee, to Lucy Laney's Haynes Institute, to Mary McLeod Bethune's, what became Bethune-Cookman College. So things that she cared about, orphanages, because she had been an orphan, senior citizens' homes, retirement homes, because her parents had died early, and she saw this people who were her parents' age, these people who had been enslaved, who now didn't have anywhere to go, obviously didn't have any retirement funds. Education, because she had not had a lot of education as a young person, and then community activities. But she knew that her community needed so much. She could feel that need because she had been a person who had needed so much.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Now, Willia, there are a whole series of questions about the Netflix series, and so I'll ask you a few, if you don't mind. One broad question is just, the experience of working on a series that was years in the making. What was your experience of that process?
So as I say, my friend Winifred White Nizer says it is a minor miracle when anything makes it finally to the stage. And I totally agree with that. A lot of people worked really hard. I spent one day on the set in Toronto, and I could just see, from the makeup folks to the costume folks to the actors to the directors to the director of photography, people had poured their heart and soul over a period of about 8 to 10 weeks to make this 4-part series. And so I'm forever grateful to them. And Octavia Spencer, for me, was the perfect person to play Madam Walker, that every time she came on screen, I felt as if the book was coming to life. So that was really gratifying for me. But it is a really long process. And I wrote my first paper in high school 50 years ago about Madam Walker. In the 1970s, early 80s, Alex Haley actually came to us. He was still riding the crest of Roots and wanted to do a mini series and write a kind of a novelized version of Madam Walker's life. I did the research for that. We had meetings with directors and historians to talk about that. So that was in the 80s, early 90s. That didn't happen. Then after my book came out, it was optioned a couple of times, and those options fell through, which is apparently a very typical Hollywood story. And then ultimately we get to the point where, for a long period of time, the conventional wisdom in Hollywood was nothing Black with a Black actor, Black lead sells overseas. Therefore, there was no interest. But then Oscar So White happened, and Shonda Rhimes and her successes, and The Butler and Selma and some other movies kind of began to change the conversation in Hollywood. And I was approached by Mark Holder, who has a production company, and he optioned the book. So that was the process. And then it took another 2.5 years for it to actually go from the book and the option to the series.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad to know that you really enjoyed Octavia Spencer's portrayal of Madam Walker. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about what she got right.
So the tenacity of Madam Walker, the drive, and just because she is such an incredible actor, just the look, just a frown, just a smile, just the physical stance. I just, she's just such a powerful actor. And that one day that I spent on the set, Demaine Davis, who's done a lot of Queen Sugar, was the director. And she did 2 scenes, 2 really, really emotional scenes. One with Kevin Carroll, who was playing F.B. Ransom. And even though the scene itself was a made-up scene, because that's what you have to do sometimes, the emotion that both of them brought to that scene, that they had to shoot over and over again. And I mean, and it was, you could tell they both were crying. They had to do that over and over again. Right. It made me understand how challenging it is. And then there was another scene with Octavia and Blair Underwood, who played Charles Joseph Walker. And this was a scene, well, people who have seen it will remember, it's a scene in a hotel room with another woman. And but it just took so much emotion. There's a line where she says, CJ, where are your shoes? So anybody who's seen it will know exactly what I'm talking about. But to see the power with those 3 actors and the director, Demaine Davis, really made me have a lot of respect for their craft, what they know about their craft.
That's terrific. So there's someone here who says he or she saw the Netflix production and was a bit bothered by early compromises that Madam Walker made. For instance, reproducing the hair product formula, which made the rest possible. At the same time, this person says it seems common to have to make not so great compromises to move ahead and to even great things later. And he or she wonders if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, that's really, they used a lot of creative license in how they told the story of Madam Walker and the formula. Because as I say, there were a lot of other products really already on the market, but it's a much more dramatic thing to say Madam Walker, stole this formula. But I don't really think that's true. I think that she was using the formula. I think there were other things she'd already tried. I think the pharmacist gave her some tips on what to mix up. So I think it's not as cut and dried as it seems. I will say another thing that bothered me that may seem, if people see it and they think it's true, there was a character called Sweetness, played by Bill Bellamy, who a lot of people love, but Sweetness was not a real character. And there was a compromise there that didn't happen in real life with Madam Walker's attorney, F.B. Ransom, supposedly the cousin of Sweetness, bet on the numbers and took some money that was obtained illegally to invest in the company. That didn't happen. And I really didn't like that because it implied that, a Black business could only succeed if there's some illegal activity. So I wish that had not been a part of the film.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another question about how the Self-Made series seemed to make much about A'Lelia Walker's being bisexual. And this person wants to know if that was creative license, if there was truth to it, and if so, if you can speak about the challenges that she would have faced being queer at that time in history.
Yeah, so that was another thing that in the script notes, I actually wish that they hadn't done because it was entirely made up. And sometimes they would, a script writer or a showrunner or a producer will say, well, we can't add 2 more characters because the real conflict they were trying to create a conflict between mother and daughter. And so they made up this character, Esther, as a girlfriend to sort of create some kind of confrontation. But the real confrontation between mother and daughter was over 2 men, both doctors, both handsome, One was a real good guy who, of course, Madam Walker liked better, and the other was kind of a bad boy with swagger, who Amelia Walker was more in love with. And of course, you know what happens, but ultimately she married both of them. But that was the real conflict. And I write about that in this new book that I'm writing. So that was entirely made up, but I don't know why they felt compelled to create this character. At one point, they had sent me a script where they had Bricktop, who was, a famous blues singer, jazz singer, as her girlfriend. And I'm like, I actually met Bricktop in the 80s. And when I was introduced to her, as she said, Amelia Walker and I didn't like each other. So at least they took that one out. Now, the other part that I will say is obviously Amelia Walker had a lot of queer friends. She, during the 20s, many of her closest friends. And I think that, I'm fine with that. And as I'm doing research for this new book, or I'm finished with the research as I'm finishing the book, I think that perhaps after 3 marriages, she may have had a relationship with another woman. I am really trying to develop what that was as I write the book, but I don't have letters. I don't have documentation. And as you know, when you're writing biography and you're writing nonfiction, as the writer, you really want to be able to nail something. So I'm trying to, work with that, but I am totally embracing the fact that many people who were in her inner circle were queer.
So Amelia, you and I were talking about your inspiration for writing this book and going back to having those figures, those teachers who encouraged you. Well, there are quite a few questions from students about that, and the questions are based in a sense that they don't have that kind of support. So, for instance, I'm a Black MFA student attending a predominantly white graduate school. I'm having a difficult time with professors who offer a reading list that is limited in terms of including people of color and women. And this person is saying that she's trying to stay true to her voice, stay true to her story and stories of Black women, and also trying to deal with these professors. And she wants to know if you have any advice.
I feel so fortunate that when I was at Columbia in graduate school, that I happened to get as my advisor, Phil Garland, who was the only Black woman on the faculty at that point. And I think Phil plays the role that so many professors of color play, where everybody comes to them. And so they can't get their own work done. But Phil was just perfect for me because she validated what I was trying to do. But I certainly, through the years, have been in other situations where I did not feel validated. And, how you reach out beyond that immediate circle when you're having to get a grade from somebody. I actually she may want to read Nell Painter's book, Old in Art School. And Nell is talking about, after Nell had been a professor at Princeton, she decided in her 60s to go to art school. And she did the whole thing from undergraduate to an MFA. And she talks about the art world. So even though Nell is, farther along in her life, I think that might be a book that would be helpful. But the other thing is that, one of the things that we've discovered with the pandemic is that sometimes you can reach people you might not have been able to reach before. And just watching seminars, watching webinars, sending a note to somebody, everybody won't say yes. But I say somebody will send me a note and I'm like, the last thing I have is time to talk on the phone. But sometimes it just touches you and you just want to make sure that person who's in the same shoes you were in 30 or 40 years ago is not out there by themselves.
Right. So there's a question about, after all the research that you've done into your ancestors, is there any other historical figure that you would like to showcase with this level and depth of scholarship?
Oh my God, I never want to write another book again. That said, actually, I do have, the good thing for me about Madam Walker and Amelia Walker is that they intersected with so many interesting people, and I am able to do research about those other people and include them. But if I do another book, it won't be this same kind of, these books take me, decades to write. But I do have a lot of other sort of fascinating people in my family who I'd like to write about, but not in a long book. I mean, I'm thinking long poems, essays, but
Yes.
they're, from Revolutionary War era soldiers to free people of color who migrated from North Carolina to Indiana. Just there's some stories I'd like to tell, but I don't have enough information to really do books about them, but
Right.
I want to make their spirits come alive.
Wonderful. Well, Amelia, we could go on and on, but unfortunately, we need to end this part of our discussion. I want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you for sharing this fascinating, important family and social history with all of us. I also want to thank audience members for their excellent questions. And I hope that many of you will join us throughout the rest of the summer and into the fall, when we will continue to have a full range of stimulating virtual public programs. And just over 2 weeks, we'll launch a series of programs marking the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And first up, on August 26th, will be to welcome the historian Martha Jones, whose work roots the generation-long movement for women's suffrage and the activism of African-American women beginning in the 1930s. You can find more information about all our upcoming events, along with videos of past programs, at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you so much again for joining us.